From the outside in, it looked like Andre Stander's career was paved in gold. At the age of 31, he was appointed captain in the Crime Investigation Department at Kempton Park. At the time, he was the youngest captain in the police force. Having investigated a number of bank robberies, Stander saw the shortcomings in bank security systems. In the 1970s, South African banks were not very security conscious at all.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me on this very cold, wet and stormy day in Cape Town. If you hear a lot of background noise, it is because it is absolutely storming outside. But today's case is going to take us into a perfect Hollywood film type of case. But it's also a case that is the stuff of legends. It includes robbery, car crashes, gunfights, you name it, it's in this case. So if you would like to hear about one of South Africa's most infamous gangs, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Andre Stander was born on the 22nd of November 1946. Andre's father was an incredibly large and dominant part of his life, and Andre's father played an incredibly large role in Andre's career path as he grew older. His father was born in 1916 in South Africa, and he was an incredibly highly rated figure within the South African Correctional Services. And Andre's father had a title of Francois Jacobus Stander. Francois made sure that from a very, very young age that Andre knew exactly where his path was going to lead him, and he made sure that Andre knew that he was going to be in the police force no matter what. Andre would constantly tell his dad that the police or the correctional services was not for him. He did not enjoy it and he did not want to be here at all. But for a man that controlled hardened criminals and incredibly violent criminals, Andre didn't really stand a chance against his general of a father. So Andre's fate was sealed. Once Andre was of age, he then enrolled in law enforcement school or police school, and he then got his diploma, and this was around 1963. But I do just want to note that just before Andre went to this law enforcement school, he did have to go to conscription, and he did fight at the border wars, and apparently he loved this kind of combat. He loved the adrenaline, and he just loved being active like that. But then he went on to study law enforcement, and then he kind of got a job straight out of graduating. He worked in a criminal investigations unit in Kempton Park in South Africa. And a lot of colleagues of Andre would say that he would constantly talk about his service at the border and the war that he was fighting at the border and how much he loved it. And he would constantly replay acts of violence that he saw. And his colleagues would just say that it seemed that this police life or this desk job that Andre had was way too boring of a life for him. Some colleagues also said that this boredom that Andre experienced working at the police force also affected his work, and Andre thought of himself as an incredibly good investigator. He thought that he was taking down bad guys left, right, and center, but his colleagues kind of had another version of Andre Stander's belief of how great he was, and they basically said that he wouldn't have been able to find his way out of a paper bag if he could. They also said that he was one of the worst investigators that they ever had. But it could just be jealousy, or it could actually be fact. But Andre eventually started working his way up, and he became the captain of the police force. And this might just be jealousy from his colleagues, but they weren't exactly impressed. And his colleagues thought that it was mostly just nepotism because his father was the general of the police correctional services. As a side note, Andre actually was married, and he did have a wife. They got married while he was still working his way up in the police force, and they were married in 1969, but the marriage didn't last, and they got divorced around 2 years after they just got married. And Andre did date on and off with another lady, and they got into quite a serious relationship as well. But a lot of the women in his life would say that Andre was so obsessed with this adrenaline rush that he couldn't really not take risks. And I think the women that he was with couldn't handle this constant living on the edge kind of thing. I think that they were maybe at an age where they just wanted to settle down, and this riding fast at night and jumping off things was just not their cup of tea anymore. I think that they had grown out of that. But Andre Stander was a ladies' man. He constantly had women on his shoulder, and he was either in a relationship with a woman, or he was maybe sleeping with ladies of the night, or it was maybe both. Maybe he was in a relationship and sleeping with other women and paying for the services at the same time. And that was just a really long side note. But like I said earlier, Andre was constantly looking for more of an adrenaline push. He wanted more oomph in his life, and he just wasn't getting it from his desk job anymore. So, like anybody would, I guess, if they wanted more adrenaline, In 1977, Andre Stander started robbing banks. And that was his idea of how to get a better adrenaline rush. And remember, Andre was ranked very highly and people didn't really question him. So if he would go away and take a longer break, people wouldn't really question. So he had that kind of authority. But when Andre would rob banks and police would go and investigate these banks after he had fled, the tellers at the bank would say that he was incredibly calm, he was incredibly gentle, and he was just a nice person. And he was known as the gentle bank robber, basically, in bank robbing standards, I guess. But then Andre started to enjoy his bank robbing a bit more than I guess he should have. And then he started to get a bit more comfortable with robbing banks. Andre started walking up to the tills a lot more aggressively, and he would kind of like shake his gun in the faces of people, especially the tellers. But he then noticed that he could shake his gun in front of people within the bank. And he loved the look of fear on people's faces, and he started getting addicted to this kind of fear. And he tried to, every time he went to rob a bank, he tried to reenact the state of fear, and he would get more and more aggressive and more in their faces in order to see the shocked and scared look within the people that he was terrorizing. So because Andre was becoming so relaxed and so nonchalant about his bank robbing, he decided now that he needed to kind of like brag and get this off his chest a bit. So he told a friend in 1979 about the banks that he had robbed, and he kind of maybe wanted him to join him. So he sat his friend down at the police station, and his friend that he was talking to worked in the security forces for the South African police force. So remember, Andre is the captain of this police force, and his friend is now the kind of head of security within the police force. And Andre sat his friend down and described exactly how he would rob these banks. So Andre said that he would fly to Durban, KwaZulu-Natal every other weekend, and he would either be scoping out the bank or he would actually go and rob the bank. And what he would do is he would get to the Joburg airport where he would fly from, and he had a parked car there where he would stash certain things. He would then take the things out of his car, he would then get on a plane to Durban, and he would then rob the bank. Andre made sure that he had a disguise ready, which was either a wig or a moustache or glasses or anything like that. Then he would steal the car again after he had robbed the bank, go back to the airport and fly home with his hoard of cash. Andre then described in detail where his friend could possibly find this car if he wanted to join him. And the friend was like listening, and he was like, okay, cool. And Andre said that this car that he had hidden at the back of the airport in the parking lot, he could find a lot of stuff in there that could help him rob banks as well. And if he was keen to meet him on a certain day at a certain time at the car, and he would know then that his friend was keen on robbing banks as well. So while Andre's busy telling his friend all of this, he's like listening, and he's like, right, cool. And he's just taking down mental notes about everything that Andre's saying, but he doesn't really engage with Andre, and he says that he will get back to him about it and you'll have a think about it. So the friend that Andre confided in, he didn't really feel right about this. He knew it was wrong, and he then went to one of his friends at the police department, and they started talking about it. And the head of security, friend of Andre, he then confided in his friend there, and they said that they were going to go together to this parked car that Andre allegedly said he had hidden, just to see if Andre was blowing smoke or if he was really telling the truth. So the two friends, they head down to the airport, so they scan in the parking lot, and they see a car parked all the way down there, and they think, okay, this is the car, let's head down to have a look. So they get to the car, they open the door, and they see that there's wigs everywhere, there's balaclavas everywhere, there's glasses, there's fake moustaches, you name it, there's any type of disguise is in this car. And now that they've seen what Andre has hidden in his car, then the tables start to turn, and they're like, okay, we have semi-evidence of what Andre has been talking about, so let's wait and see if Andre actually comes to the car, robs another bank, and then we know that we have him in the bag. And sure enough, on the 4th of January 1980, Andre starts walking towards this car, and the police have now, by the way, staked out like a permanent police car that's kind of hiding in the side to wait and watch for Andre. The police car then notifies the friends at the police station, and they then head down and to the airport as well. But they don't interfere with Andre. They let him go on his merry way, and Andre then gets on a plane to Durban, and he robs another bank. Andre then returns to Joburg, where the cops are waiting for him with 4,000 Rand in his bag, as well as all the disguises that were in the car in the first place. So police now had this infamous bank robber in their grasps. They then expedited him back to Durban to face charges for all of the bank robberies that he had done. And he had done about 30 bank robberies within this 3-year period. But while Andre Stander was busy on trial, he kind of blamed the South African government and the South African police force for why he had robbed the banks. He said that he just snapped, and one of the reasons that he snapped was because of the Soweto uprising. And I'm sure everyone knows about the South African history that happened in 1976, where the South African police force opened fire on school kids who were marching to protest government rules. And that is an incredibly brief description of what happened on that day. It is horrendous what happened. And the reason why I'm not going to go into further detail about it is because the Soweto uprising 100% deserves its own video and its own respect. But coming back to the Soweto uprising in 1976, Andre said that he was at the Soweto uprising on that day and that the government had forced him to open fire on 20 students. And he said that this absolutely terrorized him. And if it is true, it is absolutely horrific. But during the trial, a lot of police disputed these claims and the record said that he was not there. So we don't really know who to believe. Do we believe Andre Stander or do we believe the apartheid police government back in the day? Either way, what happened is inexcusable. So that was basically the reason that Andre said that he snapped. Well, one of the reasons. But the magistrate was like, actually, I don't believe you. And on the 6th of May, 1980, Andre Stander was found guilty of 28 bank robberies and was sentenced to 75 years in prison. And Andre was then shipped off to Zonderwater prison. And I don't know if it's irony or if the fates were just having it that day, but basically, Andre's cellmates that he had in the Zonderwater prison were Alan Hale and Lee McCall. And I say it's ironic because Alan Hale was in prison because he had lost his job, which is sad, but he lost his job and then he decided that he was going to choose bank robbery as a means in order to get some money. And Lee McCall was in prison because he was an incredibly good car thief. So a match made in thief heaven? I think so. But now Alan, Andre, and Ian would chat and they would talk about how they would get out. And Alan kind of brought up the subject that he was already thinking of escaping and he knew the best way to escape Zonderwater prison. And just as a side note, Zonderwater is incredibly maximum security prison. So they couldn't do a whole prison break kind of thing with the tattoos. They had to figure out another way to get out of this prison. So basically, Alan had been thinking about this for a while and he said the only way to get out is when you are actually out of prison. That's when the best time is to escape. So let me explain. Alan was basically studying a trades degree or diploma within the prison, and he was either studying to be a plumber or a builder, but because he was studying a trade, he had to go and write an exam in order to pass, or actually do some practicals in order to pass. So he would have been let out of prison to go and write these tests or to do his practicals. So when Alan was let out to write these tests or do his practicals, that is where he would want to escape, because they were being taken off prison property or prison land to be able to go write these tests off campus, basically. So Lee and Andre weren't doing a trade, so they couldn't use that excuse like Alan, but they kind of went another way and they faked an injury so that they could go see a physiotherapist off prison property as well. So on the 11th of August 1983, Ian and Andre were put into a bus with 8 other inmates and they were taken off prison property to go to a physiotherapy appointment. So they are then driven to the doctor's offices with 3 guards in the bus, and once they all get into the reception area, Andre and Ian kind of like look at each other and they then continue to overpower these 3 guards. How they managed to do that, I don't know, but Andre kind of got his hand into the guard's gun holster and he then took the gun out and held them all up by gunpoint. And then Ian and Andre escaped with the doctor's car keys. I don't know why I found that funny. I was just like, wow, this guy's trying to help you. But anyway, so they escape with the doctor's car keys and they then make a run for it. So Ian and Andre are now driving this doctor's car and they then drive to the outskirts of the city, which is around 7 kilometers outside the city, and they get to a farm of a man named Martin Ricketts. Martin lived with his wife and teenage son, but at the time his wife was out and it was just Martin and his teenage son at home. Ian and Andre then drive up into the driveway and Martin's kind of like looking through the blinds and he's calling his teenage son and he's like, hey, you know these people? The teenage son is like, I don't know who these people are. And then Andre and Ian march up to the front door, bash the door down, and they then hold Martin and his son up by gunpoint. Very cleverly, actually, Andre calls the police services and he calls them to the house and says, listen, there's like domestic dispute happening, you need to send someone down. So a police officer arrives at Martin's house and Andre and Ian then ambush this police officer. Andre takes off the police officer's clothes, he puts the clothes on himself, And then they would proceed to tie up Martin, the son, and the police officer, and they tie them and push them into the back of the police van. And then Ian and Andre get into the car and they drive off. While they were driving, Andre starts to get nervous and he kind of thinks, okay, we actually need to swap vehicles. We've been driving for a couple 100 kilometers. Let's get out and let's wave someone down. So they do that, and Andre gets out the car. He's like hanging on the side of the car with his police uniform on, and a woman drives up the road and she stops because the police van flashes her. So she behaves like a good citizen. She gets out the car, and Andre then holds her up by gunpoint and forces her into the back of the police van. And then Andre and Ian take her car, which is like a small little Opel, and they then drive off. Lee and Andre then hide away for a couple of months, and they are unknown to a lot of people until Andre starts coming out of the woodworks and he robs 2 more banks. And he also robs like convenience stores and small little locations like that. But then it seemed that Andre started getting more impatient and he needed an adrenaline rush again. And he started getting into more heinous crimes. In October 1983, for some reason, Andre pretended to be a photographer, a famous teenage photographer of like teenage models or that kind of age group. And he lured a teenager into a hotel, pretending to take photos of her, when he then took advantage of her and had his way with her. He also did this again to another teenager a couple months later as well. Now remember, we kind of forgot one guy, and that was our friend Alan in prison. Now Alan was kind of keeping things hush-hush. He was waiting for the tide to kind of level out, and he was not going to rush escaping after Ian and Andre had escaped, because police were obviously on guard. So he waited a couple months and then he had another trades test. And Alan thought this was the appropriate time to do this. So he kind of made his prison call. You know, when you always see the prisoners in the yard, that's what I kind of imagine Alan doing. He makes a call to Andre and Lee. He says, hey guys, listen, I have my trades test coming up. Please can you come get me from this trades test? So Andre and Lee agree to meet him at the site, and they wait for Alan to get into the testing center, and then they storm in and they hold the guards and the tester up by gunpoint. 3 men then drive away with a car that was in the parking lot, and they are now the trio that is on the run. And literally days after Alan had just escaped jail, they all get involved in illegal activity. They robbed a gun store at gunpoint, and this was the first kind of case where the people within the store fought back. And basically from November 1983 to the 4th of January 1984, the trio of men were going absolutely nuts and absolutely wild with their illegal activity. They even robbed 4 banks in one day. Now, if we had to convert the amount of money that Alan, Lee, and Andre had stolen, it would be millions or tens of millions of rands in the time now. So the men were getting more and more infamous, and because they were getting more famous, I guess, their faces were being plastered everywhere, their pictures were everywhere, they were on the news, and people started to recognize them. And Andre kept saying that they need to escape this fame, and eventually the 3 of them mustered up a plan to leave South Africa. But obviously the 3 of them couldn't fly, their faces were everywhere, and the police would notice them leaving the country with their passports and their actual name. So the 3 of them decided to buy a yacht called the Lily Rose. So they bought a yacht for basically half the money that they've stolen over these 3 years, which is a lot of money. And I'm not sure why the yacht was so much money, maybe it was really big, but anyway. And Andre kind of decided, because the yacht was in Cape Town and they were in Joburg, that he was going to go down to Cape Town, and I don't know how he was going to get up to Joburg because there's no sea that way, but he decided that the friends would eventually meet up with him, and that's how it would work. But when Andre went to Cape Town to fetch this yacht that he bought, he actually sold it to an American. And I don't think that he gave any of the money to Lee and Alan, because Andre then took a flight to Florida where he went under a fake name. And Alan and Lee were left back in Joburg, and Andre took a flight on the 24th of January 1984. Now, because Andre ditched his buddies, CCTV footage of Lee and Alan were getting more and more common, because obviously they had to go out, they had to get food. They were also still kind of engaging in illegal activity. They were sleeping with a lot of women, paying for this, and I don't think it was legal back then. But police were now honing in on the 2 remaining members in South Africa of the Stander gang. Lee was busy sleeping in one of the safe houses of the Stander gang in Johannesburg when police were tipped off by one of the women that they had paid for that he was staying in this particular area. So on the 30th of January 1984, police rocked up outside the safe house with one of those really loud horn things, and they shouted inside the building and said, if no one comes out of this building, they're going to open fire and they will just kill everybody inside the building. Luckily, if other people were in the building, it was only Lee that was in there on that day, and Lee was not going down without a fight. He started opening fire on the police officers. They started shooting back, and it was just guns blazing, and police even started throwing grenades into the windows of Lee's safe house. Eventually, the gunfire went very, very quiet, and police then entered the house, and they noticed that Lee had passed away right by the front door. Now, let's go back to America, where Andre was. While Andre was in America, he managed to purchase a second-hand car. So Andre knew that he had to now leave America because the police in America were getting close, and they were being tipped off by the South African police force that there was a criminal in their midst. So while Andre was driving and trying to get lost within the small cities and towns of America, he was pulled over, and the police officers then looked at his driver's license, and this was seen to be fake. And then he was taken into custody and put into jail for a night. He was then later released the next day, and after he was released, police then got like one of those fax photos of perpetrators that could be in their area or fugitives from South Africa, and it was Andre Stander. And the police kind of looked at each other and they were like, we just let this guy go. So there was now a manhunt for Andre Stander, and they kind of figured out from where Andre bought his car that he had written down his address. And so police then drove over and waited for Andre at his house. Andre was not there, but they kind of just waited around, and then they saw Andre kind of riding to the house on a bicycle. Andre then walked up to his front door, and police came up from behind him and held him up at gunpoint, and Andre was not going to go down quietly. Andre then tackled the police officer, and shots then rang out, and one bullet went straight through Andre's heart, and he bled to death on his driveway. By the way, Alex Hales was in England at the time, so remember Lee McCall had been shot dead in South Africa, and now Andre Stander had been shot dead in America. And now Alan Hales was the last remaining survivor of the Stander gang. And he was in England, and he had stashed a lot of his money within a safe house that he had in England. And then he went to Spain, robbed a couple banks in Spain, but the police authorities in England now knew that he was living there. So they now had a manhunt out for him, and Alan now wants to get this money back that he had in his house. So he asked an ex-con that he knew, and he asked this guy now to help him out. And I guess once a thief, because this ex-con now said to him, okay, I'll get the money for you, I'll help you back into England. And he kind of only held up half the bargain. He did manage to get Alan Hales back into England, but he took all of the money from his safe house and kept it for himself, and then called police on Alan Hales. Alan Hales was arrested and then put on trial, and that was in May of 1985. Alan Hales was sentenced to 9 years in an English prison for his crimes, and South Africa were begging, please, we want him back, please give him back, he needs to face his crimes here in South Africa. And England was like, well, actually he can face some time here in England, and then we'll give back Alan Hales to you once he's served half of his sentence in England. Which they did. They promised. As soon as he was put on parole and served around half of his sentence, Alan Hales was then expedited back to South Africa, and this was around 1990. Alan Hales was then tried in South Africa, and he was sentenced to 25 years. And because he managed to break out of Zonderwater prison before, he was not sent back there. He was sent to Krugersdorp prison, and Alan Hales was released on parole in 2005, by the way. A lot of people said that once Alan came out of prison, he was a completely changed man. He was a man of God. He really tried to help people, especially younger youths. He really tried to help them and not go down the same kind of criminal path that he went down. He did a lot of motivational speaking, and especially with children. Alan Hales then passed away from natural causes on the 17th of April 2020. So like I said, this is a very, very movie-like kind of case, and that was the South African Stander gang. It's kind of a different type of story that we've covered here before, but still full of crime, full of heinous acts. I don't know, do you think justice was served in the end? Let me know your thoughts down below. I hope you were entertained. Please stay safe out there and don't talk to strangers, and I'll see you again next week. Bye!